going to talk about Winston Churchill tonight. I did talk a couple of months ago up here about Jack the Ripper, and I apologised before I actually started talking that some of the slides were a little bit gruesome. Tonight, ladies, it's your lucky night. Tonight, you're going to see naked men's bottoms, okay? In the form of Albert Finney. Sadly, it's not the 1960s Albert Finley version of his bum that you're going to see. You're going to see his 2000 version, but more of that in a minute. So, at the end as well, just to finish the session off, there'll be a light-hearted bit of Winston Churchill's absolutely filthy wit. So if you're appalled by bad taste jokes and rather risque jokes, sorry. Anyway, we're going to talk about Sir Winston Churchill tonight. So, obviously, one of the most famous people of the last century, probably of the last 1,000 years. So how do you do a presentation like this? How do you tell you something you don't know about a man? Well, there is an awful lot that people don't know about Winston Churchill, and hopefully I'm going to fill in some gaps tonight. Churchill himself once famously said, "History will be kind to me as I intend to write it," and rightly he did. Underlying this statement is the undoubted truth that history favours the winners. And regardless of your opinion of Winston Churchill, nobody can ever realistically say he wasn't a winner. But what was the truth about Winston? Was he, as some would say, the greatest Englishman, the greatest European of the last 1,000 years, able to predict the future, a strong and decisive leader, or as some of his critics would say, a warmonger, a drunkard, somebody blessed by good fortune, someone who was in the right place at the right time, and someone who lived a charmed life? Well, we'll explore some of those ideas in a moment. But in 1939, just after the Second World War broke out, Churchill famously described Russia as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. And that really could have been said about Churchill. Churchill, the famous war leader. Churchill, the Nobel Prize winning author. The artist who was good enough to be exhibited. He was a bricklayer, skilled bricklayer, a soldier, a statesman. Someone, and possibly you may not know this, who suffered from clinical depression for all of his adult life. And he called these moods his black dogs. And, worryingly, all through the Second World War, he had periods of real deep depression that he called his black dogs, but we'll talk about that more later. Now, when you think of Churchill, you immediately think of the great conservative war leader, but that's not necessarily true. Churchill was a man who was hated by the Conservative Party for many years, and he certainly wasn't their choice to replace Chamberlain in May 1940. Churchill himself once described himself as always fundamentally a liberal. Churchill said in 1903, if our MP's in the audience, put your finger in your ears, but he said, "I'm an English liberal. I hate the Tory party, their men, their words and their methods." So straight away you have this contrast, people believe him to be the great Conservative leader. But my presentation tonight will firstly look back at his early life, a time that did so much to shape his future career, and secondly, the period spanning the First and Second World Wars, and finally, and briefly, we'll touch on the rather sad last years of his life. At the end of it, you can decide whether he was a hero or villain, chancer or genius. But firstly, and this is where, ladies, you get to see Albert Finney's bare bottom, I'm going to show you a clip from a great series that appeared a few years ago called The Gathering Storm, if you ever watched it. This particular clip introduces us to some of the themes so important to his life, namely history, Britain and its place in the world, India, the rise of Nazism, and Britain's failure to rearm in the 1930s, and also about his dysfunctional family, to say the least. It was India that was one of the reasons why Hitler was drawn to Churchill in some ways, because he realised that here was someone that was speaking with a passion He wasn't towing the party line, but it was something that made Churchill a political pariah through most of the 1930s. So again, if you're going to be upset by a naked bum, look away, but you'll also see Ronnie Barker appearing in one of his last acting roles, the great Ronnie Barker.
Mr. Speaker, will the 30s go down as the decade which witnessed the destruction and downfall of the British Empire? That witnessed the wanton self-destruction of the British Empire. If India were granted self-government, it would mark the downfall of the British Empire. It would mark and consummate the downfall of the British Empire.
The drenches are wanted.
On my way.
Happy days are here again.
All together, shout it now that.
Morning, Issues.
Morning.
Better do something about Miss Sarah's gramophone. I don't want to start the day with another family altercation.
No, madam.
Hi, Mummy. Morning, darling.
Inges, kindly tell my daughter to turn off that bloody gramophone. Trashy music all over the house.
There he goes up.
She knows I can't stand it. Why does she do it?
Leave it to me, sir, will you?
Have you been drinking?
This time of the morning, sir? Certainly not.
If you have, I hope it's your damn whiskey and not mine. What time is Mrs. P coming?
Early afternoon, sir.
Early afternoon. Why not this morning?
Because you told her not to come till after lunch, sir.
Your invention, I did nothing of the sort.
You said you were...
So there, that's Churchill and Chartwell and raising some of the issues that we're going to talk about in a moment. You're probably aware that on his father's side, Churchill was descended from a long line of British nobility. The Duke of Marlborough, or the Dukes of Marlborough, a title first bestowed by Queen Anne in 1702 on the victor of Blenheim, who you saw in that clip there, John Churchill. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was an American socialite and heiress, and she was said to be one of the most beautiful women of her age. That picture is actually the engagement picture between Churchill's father, Lord Randolph, and Jenny. Lord Randolph proposed to Jenny 3 days after he met her, and the couple finally married in April 1874, and this is their engagement picture. Now, if you look Churchill up on the list of famous premature babies, you will find that Sir Winston is shown as being 2 months premature. Well, 7 months after the young couple married, Lord Randolph wrote to his mother-in-law to say that Jenny, now Lady Randolph, had taken a fall during a walk on Tuesday. A rather imprudent and rough carriage ride back to the palace brought on the pains of labour the following Saturday night. And Churchill was born on the 30th of November 1874 at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, 2 months early, allegedly. So there he is, young Winston. At the time, his father, Randolph, was a leading Conservative MP and someone tipped to be a future Prime Minister. His father eventually became Chancellor of the Exchequer, something that Winston also did, but Randolph resigned and died early, possibly as a result of syphilis. Certainly that's what Winston always believed had killed his father. After his death, Jenny married twice more and took many lovers. She had a particular fondness for young army officers and men with money. I won't repeat the joke that was made about her at the time. But far more importantly to Winston Churchill in his earlier life was this lady, Mrs. Elizabeth Everest. Even though she never married, her name was given as Mrs. Elizabeth Everest. She was nanny to the Churchill family and started that job in 1875. Later on, she was responsible for not only Winston, but also for his younger brother, Jack. Lord and Lady Randolph Churchill were very active in society, but emotionally they were very distant from the children, even neglectful of their son. Young Winston became very close to this lady, and he addressed her as womb, the nearest he could get to saying woman. At that time, and all through his life, he had a speech impairment, and at that time he could only say womb rather than woman. He wrote in his autobiography, "I loved my mother dearly, but at a distance. My nurse was my confidant. Mrs. Everest, it was she who I looked after me and tended to all my wants. It was her I poured out my many troubles to." When she died, Churchill spent the remainder of his life making sure that her grave was maintained and flowers were put on a grave regularly. So Winston goes off to school, to Harrow School, where he struggles. He struggles with his work apart from 2 subjects, history and English, and he's suffering from acute loneliness. He begs in his letters to his parents to come and see him, but particularly his father is very, very distant. After school, much to his father's disgust, he just about scrapes into Sandhurst Military Academy and sees action in India and the Sudan. He then leaves the army, becomes a war correspondent covering the Second Boer War, and when he's captured, he escapes. There he is, that's with him, his brother Jack. He escapes from Boer capture, and they place a reward of £25 on his head, but he escapes back to England. So he arrives back in England and decides to be a Conservative MP or stand for office. A war hero, connected to one of the most famous families in the country. He doesn't have any problems at all when he gets elected. But as more or less, as soon as he becomes an MP, people start raising eyebrows about him. They see him as a dangerous radical, supporting very unusual causes like rights for trade union members, pensions for the old, and he was also anti-protectionism. The Conservatives looked upon him as a rogue, as a radical, someone they couldn't trust. So in 1904, he famously crosses the floor of the House of Commons and joins the Liberals, the main opposition party. In 1906, the Liberals come to power and Churchill becomes a government minister. On the 8th of September 1908, he and Clementine, his wife, were married. Clementine also, you may find this difficult to believe, had a lifelong mistrust of Conservatives. She was a liberal, a radical liberal, or at least she claimed to be. Now, not a lot is known about the children of their marriage, but they had 5 children: Diana, Randolph, Sarah, Marigold and Mary. And with the exception of Mary, all of them had happy lives. Particularly Randolph, he has to try and live up to the expectations of his father. Now, Churchill was nothing if not someone who was able to take a photo opportunity. And this picture is taken at the famous siege of Sydney Street in London's East End. He was Home Secretary at the time, so he was called to the siege where some Russian anarchists were held up, battle ensues and they died there. But he took his duties seriously and he was Home Secretary, and one of the duties of Home Secretary is to confirm or reject a death sentence, someone's going to be hung. And Churchill often spent hours and hours looking at the case, trying to find a reason not to sign the guy's final appeal off. He hated having to confirm death sentences. So, World War I breaks out, and Churchill is now First Lord of the Admiralty. Next to the Prime Minister, that's the most important job in the government. The Navy is the largest in the world. It's the size of the next 2 navies put together. It's the basis of defending the empire, and it's the main thing that the Great Britain can offer in the First World War until the army is really mobilised. So he remains in office until the disastrous Dardanelles campaign in the early part of World War I. What was he trying to achieve? He was trying to find a way to break the deadlock on the Western Front, in this case an attack on the Germans through Turkey. The military operation fails. He leaves office in disgrace, and he can only do one thing now, and that is to head for the Western Front to be a soldier. It was after this Gallipoli disaster that Churchill experiences one of the most severe depressive periods of his life. Clementine wrote, "I thought he would die with grief," said Clementine. He leaves politics, signs up and joins the army. If you notice, can anybody notice what's unusual about the picture on the left-hand side?
French helmet.
Yeah, he's wearing a French helmet. He wore that, A, because he liked it, but also it's believed that when he was serving with his regiment, his battalion on the First World War, which is the other 2 pictures there, he was trying to draw attention to himself. He took ridiculous risks. The idea of being in a trench, you keep your head down, he kept putting his head up. People believed he was deliberately trying to get himself killed, but he couldn't. The Germans didn't kill him. 6 months later, he returns back to London and he's back into the government. However, he's still being blamed for the Dardanelles Gallipoli disaster. Okay, we now move on to the 1920s. He's left the Liberals finally, rejoined the Conservatives, and he's now got even more enemies than he ever had before. He decides he's going to take on a bodyguard, and his bodyguard is that guy next to him called Walter Thompson, who used to be a post office messenger. How he got the job of being Churchill's bodyguard, I'm not sure. But there are lots of different attempts to kill Churchill. Probably the most famous one is he's riding around Hyde Park with Walter Thompson in the car when Thompson sees 2 IRA gunmen standing by a tree, signalling into another one. Thompson does the proper thing, leans over and dives over Churchill. Churchill decides to get out and try and shoot the IRA gunman. Churchill was a crack shot. At the end of the Second World War, Hitler kills himself by shooting himself in the head. If the Germans had ever invaded England, you would have bet your bottom dollar that Churchill would have gone out with his gun and he would have made sure that he was killed fighting. He was an absolute crack shot. And when he found out the IRA and other people wanted to kill him, he wanted to take part in the battle. He also went to Egypt, where he was on a train where the train was being stoned, and he sat there smoking his pipe, smoking his cigar as he went along through. Now, so far I've pictured a Churchill probably that comes over as a boy's own hero. He had lots and lots of failings. Things that he said, for example, about striking Welsh miners, needing lead in their bellies because they were starving. Periods of things that he did around the general strike in 1926 and the Bengal famine. That's a controversial subject. But Churchill was not a paragon of virtue. He had his weaknesses, he had his faults. He was an opportunist as well. So this is a period when Churchill is trying to get back into government, into a serious position in Parliament. But of course this long-term antagonism, apathy towards him continues. Now, while he's in and out of Parliament during the 1920s and 1930s, he starts writing seriously. One of the things he does, he goes to New York in 1931. He comes out of his hotel and he forgets to look left and right. A car comes up, knocks him down. He ends up seriously injured. In fact, he was nearly killed. And it's a little known fact that Hitler was also nearly killed by a car in Munich in 1931. So you just wonder what history would have happened had one or either of them have been killed. And in fact, Churchill wanted to meet Hitler in 1934. Hitler turned up at the coffee house, but Hitler decided that Churchill wasn't very important, so he didn't need to see him. Now, scandal. Churchill and his wife were married for 57 years. They're pictured as the paragons of the lovey couple. However, in the 1930s, it's almost certain that Winston had an affair with that woman. Her name was Lady Castle Rose. And not to... it was a bit of a revenge affair, because he thought that Clementine, who was away at that time, was also having an affair. The evidence of whether she had an affair is fairly flaky, but it's pretty certain that he had an affair with her. I thought, when I looked at that picture, he's actually holding a hand, but he's not, he's actually holding a rock. Okay, so right in that video clip, you saw Churchill was based at Chartwell. Churchill loved that home. Clementine hated it all of her life. Churchill was in constant debt. He was unable to budget. So he's still being vilified, but the one thing that he's doing above all else, apart from India, talking about India, is warning of the dangers of appeasement. He says that appeasement will lead to war. People who had experienced the First World War said, no, we're never going to do that again. No cause, no argument is ever worth the bloodshed that's going to happen again. So we don't want war. Churchill is saying all the time, you've got to rearm, you've got to defend yourself against Hitler. And of course, what happens? The Conservative policy, or the government's policy, Chamberlain's policy of appeasement fails. Germany invades Poland, and a few days after that happens, Britain is at war again with Germany. And the one thing that the government needs now is some winners, because they are being shown to be a weak and indecisive government. So he comes back to his old position as First Lord of the Admiralty, the post that he held in the First World War. Now, by May 1940, the French and the British are in grave danger of losing the war. Worse than that, defeatism is spreading throughout the British government circles. Many people, including that guy on the right, Edward Wood, First Earl Halifax, want to make some deal or approachment with the Germans. But Churchill maintains the position. There can be no negotiation. Even though he does weaken on one occasion, he stands it out. Chamberlain survives a vote of no confidence, but is so badly damaged that he realises he can't continue as Prime Minister. The choice is between these two guys, Halifax and Churchill. Now, there's lots of different arguments and debates about what actually happened, but the essence of it was that Churchill, just for once in his life, managed to keep his mouth shut for a few seconds, and he let Halifax hang himself, because Halifax is a Lord. He didn't think it was practical to be Prime Minister while he was in the Lords. So Chamberlain reluctantly has to say to the King, the man you need for the job is Winston Churchill. Now, if you've, anybody, put your hands up if you've seen Darkest Hour. Right, all the cheapskates that haven't, you now get 4 minutes of the film. It's glorified, it's a bit jingoistic, I know. The film itself, the silly underground scene, never happened. But if you want to see a masterpiece in acting, just watch this. And remember, the only people that heard this speech were the people that were in Parliament at the time. It wasn't on the radio, the King didn't hear it, and certainly Clementine never heard it.
To the question of invasion, I would observe that there has never been a period in all these long centuries of which we boast when an absolute guarantee against invasion could have been given to our people. But I have myself full confidence that if all do their duty, if nothing is neglected, and the best arrangements are made as they are being made, we shall prove ourselves once more able to defend our island home, to ride out the storm of war, and to outlive the menace of tyranny, if necessary, for years, if necessary, alone. At any rate, that is what we are going to try to do. That is the resolve of His Majesty's government, every man of them. That is the will of Parliament and the nation. The British Empire and the French Republic, linked together in their cause and in their need, will defend to the death their native soil, aiding each other like good comrades to the utmost of their strength. Even though large tracts of Europe and many old and famous states have fallen or may fall into the grip of the Gestapo and all the odious apparatus of the Nazi rule, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender! And if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or large part of it were subjugated and starving, then our empire, beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry carry on the struggle until in God's good time the new world, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old.
Nobody from Public Performing Rights Association. It's him. He put it on there. It wasn't me. Right, it wasn't me. Right. I mean, that just proves two things to you. Hopefully, Gary Newman must be one of the best actors in the world and deservedly won an Oscar for that. But if you listen carefully to what Churchill's speech was saying, he's actually telling people the country has suffered one of its worst military disasters ever. That there is a possibility that the country is going to be invaded soon, but I'll come back to that in a minute. But there are lots of people still alive who believe that they heard that on the radio. Nobody ever heard that. The version, if you go on YouTube, listen to him reading that speech again, was actually made in 1949, after the war, and he failed a couple of times to do it because he didn't think it was good enough. Also, interestingly, at the end of that speech, when everybody's clapping on the back, he turned around and said to somebody, right, let's go and get some broken bottles and we're going to break them further and we're going to use the bottom of them to fight the Germans with, because that's all we bloody got left, because the army had been destroyed in France. So, Churchill has to try and convince the country to stay in the war. But, more importantly, he has to convince the rest of the world that Britain will fight on. He knows that Britain can never beat Germany. All he can hope for is that America comes to his aid. So, when people talk about his genius, this is an example of his genius. On the 3rd of July, he orders the Royal Navy to try and get what's left of the French fleet to join the British Navy and carry on the fight against the Germans. For whatever reason, you can read in the history of this, it doesn't happen. So Churchill gives the order for the British Navy to fire on French ships. 1,300 French sailors are killed in an afternoon. Churchill goes back to Parliament to explain why it was necessary. He's crying as he tells Parliament the reason why he took the decision. Had it gone wrong, had the British ships suffered major damage or loss, or the French had come out fighting, then probably the government would have fallen and the war would have been over. Churchill could have lost the war in an afternoon, but he took the decision to do that, to tell the Americans in particular that Britain fights on. So, the Battle of Britain continues, and the fear of invasion across the Channel obviously remains. Except, of course, for one important thing. I don't believe for 1 minute that Churchill ever believed an invasion was possible. He had to convince the people to carry on the fight, and the idea of an invasion by the Germans across, well, it would have been here probably, rather than the North Sea, was the accepted norm. For months, people believed that any time the Germans were invade the country. Except, of course, in August 1940, Churchill, who's lost nearly every tank that the British Army has got in France, gives the instruction that tanks are to be sent to the Middle East to fight the Italians. Now, why would you do that when you desperately need them at home? That's an unanswered question. I don't believe that he ever thought that invasion was possible. But what is certain is Churchill was the master of publicity. And it's said in that clip that he mobilised the English language and sent it into battle. He kept the country going. Besides being a magnificent speaker, Churchill had in abundance the ability to show his emotions. And I can only really think of two recent politicians who could do it as well as he could. One was Reagan and the other one's probably Obama. In his biography of Churchill, Roy Jenkins, it's an excellent book by the way, describes how Churchill goes to the East End of London to inspect some bomb damage. And this is an area where Churchill was largely hated for lots of different reasons. People didn't like him at all, particularly the dockers. And he's walking down the street and he sees a scene of utter devastation. And what he sees reduces him to tears. He starts crying, uncontrollably crying. And an elderly woman shouts out, "You see, he really cares." And Churchill, from then on, is cheered on the rest of his visit by people for the remainder of his visit. Now, you contrast that with Hitler, who, when Germany was being bombed during 1942, 43, 44, would never go and inspect it, would never meet people. Churchill was a man of emotion and a man of the people. So Britain fights on, as we all know, but there's no real prospect of winning the war until salvation comes his way in 1941, when first Russia, then America enters the war. He actually survives a vote of no confidence in Parliament, and the war drags on. And now, at the age of 70, he's attending war conferences all over the world and putting his life in constant danger. But now Churchill and Britain is becoming this junior partner in the alliance between America, Russia and Great Britain. And Churchill realises this. He's aware that Britain's role is declining, and he's aware now that his mental and physical capacity is declining, and it pushes him into further bouts of depression. During the war, he has at least one stroke, attacks of pneumonia and periods of depression. All of this with a workload that would have killed men half his age. And all the time this is going on, people are still trying to kill him. The Germans thought up an idea of trying to kill him by putting a bomb in a cauldron that contained bangers and mash, because they knew that he liked that. But possibly the most serious assassination attempt. If you've ever seen Leslie Howard, the guy in Gone with the Wind, he was working for the British government, and Churchill was in Portugal and he was flying back to London, and Leslie Howard, of Gone with the Wind fame, got on the plane with his manager, who bore an absolute strong resemblance to Winston Churchill. The plane was shot down, but Churchill flies on back to London. So the war comes to its inevitable conclusion. Churchill is against the invasion of France because he thinks that that's going to be a cauldron of disaster. And people have believed earlier that Churchill knew about the Japanese invasion or attack on Pearl Harbor, but he never told the Americans that. Now, of all his wartime allies, he gets on well with Roosevelt and Stalin, but the one that he has problems with is de Gaulle. And on one occasion, he referred to de Gaulle as, "What can you do with a man who looks like a female llama surprised when he landed?" His attacks on people included General Montgomery. He wasn't very impressed with him. But when the war comes towards its end, Churchill goes to Germany and he has this lifelong ambition of doing something. He does it here on one of those stones, and he also does it into the Rhine. I'll let you work out what it is. He ordered the photographers not to take the picture. So the war ends in Europe, but Churchill presses ahead with a general election, which to everybody's surprise, he loses. He's freed from power. He can now concentrate on writing. And if ever you're interested, there's a book called The Dream that he wrote in 1947. If you've been to Chartwell, you know at the bottom of the garden there's an art studio where Churchill used to go to paint. And in The Dream, the book, he dreams that he was in there one November afternoon with a thick fog outside, and he looks round as he's painting a picture of his late father, and he sees his father sitting in the corner of the room. And it ends with his father saying to him, "When I hear you talk I really wonder why you didn't go into politics. You might have done a lot to help people. You might even have made a name for yourself. So, finally, he regains his premiership, leaves office in 1964. I know we're getting near the end now. He's awarded honorary citizenship of the United States. But when Churchill dies, even in death, his death is controversial. You've probably seen the famous films of the cranes on the Thames being lowered. Apparently there's a story that the only way the dockers would do it on a Saturday was to be paid overtime. I don't know if that's true or not, but there's some elephant of truth. They offered him the chance to be buried in Westminster Abbey, obviously when he was alive, not before he died, but he preferred the simplicity of St Martin's near his birthplace at Blenheim Palace. Now, a little bit of light-heartedness. Couple of things that Churchill was really famous for. One was his drinking, and one was his wit. We'll come on to the wit in a minute. But his drinking. When he died, his favourite champagne was Pol Roger. And they put a black band round their champagne, I think it was for about 20 or 30 years, to commemorate his death. So, someone once, a guy called Henry Wallop from the Daily Telegraph, decided he'd try to drink like Churchill did. And this is what happened.
Winston Churchill did drink whiskey and soda all throughout the morning, pretty much all throughout the afternoon. His favourite brand was Johnny Walker, but everyone says that they were very weak. The whiskey only just covered the bottom of the tumbler, and then it was filled up with soda water. Churchill used to always work in bed in the morning, still in his dressing gown, surrounded by secretaries and piles of paper. And this is when he would have his first drink. Around about 9:30, the famous Johnny Walker very weak whiskey and soda. Some people described it as mouthwash. 10:30 in the morning, second drink of the day, a top up, another whiskey and soda. Cheers. It's 11:30 in the morning, my third whiskey and soda. His other favourite drink, which he drank all throughout his life, was champagne, and his favourite brand was Pol Roger. Now, he got through a bottle at lunch and a bottle at supper on average every day. That sounds an astonishing amount of champagne, but in fact, he was invariably drinking imperial pint-sized bottles, not these modern 75 centilitre bottles. After lunch, Winston would like a glass of cognac. Winston Churchill used to have a proper, full-on, hour-long siesta. So now, if you excuse me, I'm off to bed. Well, my afternoon nap was very restorative. We must work, and we must drink. So it's now mid-afternoon, and it's time for another whiskey and soda. So it's 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It's another weak whiskey and soda. 6 o'clock. It's another weak whiskey and soda. I just feel it gassy. I'm so terribly sorry. Not roaring and drunk at all. Often before dinner, you have yourself a little glass of dry Amontillado. I will be having a glass of dry Amontillado. It's dinner, which means more champagne. Let's see how we do. It's 11 o'clock at night, and I just can't drink any more champagne. I feel completely in awe of Winston Churchill, who by this point not only would have finished this bottle, he would have moved on to the brandy. I am defeated. Completely defeated. I feel sick.
There you are. And if anything, that was probably an underestimate of what he got through during the day. So finally then, his wit. Churchill, if you read his life story and his books about him, there are lots of examples of his wonderful wit, but I'll give you 3 or 4 just before I finish. His grandson crawled into his bedroom one day while Churchill was working and asked him whether it was true that what he'd heard about him was true, that he was the greatest man in the world. Churchill replied, "Yes, it is now, bugger off." Speaking of Conservative politician Stanley Baldwin, who he really did hate, Churchill said, I wish Stanley Baldwin no ill, but it would have been much better he'd never lived. There was a particularly odious Labour MP. I'm getting the Labour Party in somewhere, don't worry, it's been all Conservative so far. But there was a particularly odious Labour MP called Tom Dryburgh, and Churchill said of him, he's the man who gives buggery a bad name. Of the Americans, he said, you could always count on Americans to do the right thing after they tried everything else. And then finally, God, if only I could say something as clever as this, and this is a true story. So Churchill is Prime Minister back again, he's working in his papers, and the government chief whip comes to tell him that some Tory minister has disgraced himself again. The MP was caught on a park bench in Hyde Park at 6 o'clock one February morning, having sex with a guardsman. Now, this is obviously going to be a big scandal for the government. How do they handle it? So the party machine goes into overdrive to think that the minister's got to resign and someone's got to tell Churchill this. So Churchill's sitting in his study at Chartwell. So he doesn't turn round from his desk whilst the chief whip is relaying this unhappy event. Churchill says after a long pause, I won't do his voice, do you mean to say that so-and-so was caught with a guardsman? Yes, Prime Minister. On a park bench? Yes. At 6 o'clock in the morning? Yes, that's right. In this weather? Yes, Prime Minister. By God, man, it makes you proud to be British. And that is a true story. So I began my talk by asking whether Churchill was indeed a great man. Early in the Second World War, he had the great good sense to appoint this guy to be his chief of staff. Now, you can go on Amazon tonight and buy this book for 54p. I checked earlier on. If you really want to know what happened in the Second World War from a British perspective, read this. This guy was Britain's greatest soldier. Forget about Montgomery. None of them compare to this guy. General, later Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke. And he keeps a diary all through the war. And there are many occasions when Alan Brooke wants to resign. He has furious rows with Churchill, but finally Churchill was defeated in the election, and Brooke writes this in his diary on the 27th of July 1945. I shall look back on the years I worked with him as some of the most difficult and trying ones of my life. For all of that, I thank God that I was given the opportunity of working alongside such a man and of having my eyes open to the fact that occasionally such supermen exist on this earth. I hope you've enjoyed that, and if anybody's got any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Right, folks, any questions at all? No? Okay. You got off easy there. Go and enjoy the rest of your drink. That was fantastic. Really, really enjoyed it. Right, folks, so our final guest speaker tonight